"Sir, you can't board this yacht." The sentence sliced through the warm Miami evening like a sudden change in weather, sharp enough that conversations nearby stalled mid-sentence and the soft clinking of champagne glasses faded into an uneasy pause. The yacht was nearly 120 feet long, polished white from hull to railing, its deck glowing under rows of golden lights strung above the upper lounge like a floating skyline. Music drifted across the marina from hidden speakers, smooth jazz layered with the quiet hum of the ocean, and the scent of expensive cologne and sea air mixed together in the humid Florida night. The party had been advertised as one of the most exclusive social events of the summer, a private invitation-only celebration for investors, celebrities, and industry leaders cruising just off Biscayne Bay. And yet right there at the boarding ramp, just a few feet from the gleaming teak deck, the night had suddenly stalled because of one man standing calmly in front of the hostess who had just told him he didn't belong. Lindsay Parker had been greeting guests for nearly an hour, checking names against a digital list on the tablet in her hand, while offering polished smiles to everyone who arrived wearing tailored suits, designer dresses, and watches that probably cost more than most cars parked along the marina. Lindsay knew exactly what this event represented. She had been told 3 times during the briefing that this guest list contained people whose net worths could buy small islands. She had been told that appearances mattered. She had been told that every person stepping onto that yacht represented influence, status, and image. So when the tall black man approached the ramp alone wearing a simple black blazer, dark jeans, and no visible jewelry, Lindsay's smile had faded almost instantly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even rudeness at first. It was something colder than that. A quick glance from head to toe. A quiet decision made in less than 2 seconds. The kind of judgment that doesn't ask questions before forming conclusions. She held out her hand slightly, as if stopping traffic. "Sir, this is a private event." The man stopped politely at the bottom of the ramp. He didn't argue. He didn't step forward. He simply looked past Lindsay toward the yacht where laughter and music continued as if nothing unusual had happened. From where he stood, he could see the upper deck where guests leaned against the railings sipping drinks beneath soft amber lights. Waiters moved smoothly between small groups carrying trays of sparkling water and crystal glasses filled with pale champagne. The skyline of Miami glowed in the distance, towers of glass and steel reflecting across the dark water like a second city floating upside down. It was the kind of scene magazines described as effortless luxury. And now a dozen pairs of curious eyes were beginning to turn toward the gangway, where Lindsay still blocked the entrance. "Do you have an invitation?" she asked, her voice louder now that a few nearby guests had slowed their conversations to listen. The man studied her calmly. His expression didn't change. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. It was the look of someone who had walked into situations like this before and already knew how they usually unfolded. "I'm here for the party," he said quietly. Lindsay's fingers tapped against the tablet screen as she scrolled through names. A small crease appeared between her eyebrows. She tilted the device slightly toward the marina lights as if better lighting might somehow rearrange the list into something that made sense to her. Behind the man, another guest arrived at the dock wearing a navy suit and carrying a gold invitation card. Lindsay glanced up immediately and greeted him with a bright practice smile. "Good evening. Welcome aboard." The man stepped around the tall stranger without hesitation and walked up the ramp. The contrast was subtle but unmistakable. One guest welcomed without question. Another paused at the entrance like a problem waiting to be solved. Lindsay returned her attention to the man still standing on the dock. "I'm not seeing your name on the list," she said. The music from the deck floated down again, but now it seemed quieter, as if even the band had sensed the shift in energy near the entrance. 2 women standing near the rail leaned slightly closer together, whispering while glancing toward the gangway. One of them discreetly lifted her phone, not quite recording yet, but clearly curious about what might happen next. The man at the ramp noticed the attention spreading through the crowd, but his posture didn't change. He stood straight with his hands relaxed at his sides, looking not like someone trying to force his way into a party, but like someone patiently waiting for the room to catch up to something he already understood. Lindsay looked him over again, slower this time. She had worked enough high-profile events to believe she could read people quickly. Wealth, she had learned, usually arrived with certain signals. Expensive watches, luxury brands, The confident impatience of people used to getting past velvet ropes without explanation. This man had none of those signals. Just calm. And calm, in Lindsay's mind, wasn't proof of belonging. If you don't have confirmation, she continued, lowering her voice slightly but still loud enough for nearby guests to hear, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. The man glanced toward the yacht once more. A breeze drifted across the marina, carrying the sound of laughter from the upper deck and rustling the small row of flags along the stern. It was a beautiful night. 80 degrees, clear skies, the ocean reflecting the city lights like glass. The kind of night people posted online with captions about unforgettable moments. And yet right here at the entrance, something else entirely was unfolding. You may want to check again, the man said. Lindsay exhaled softly through her nose, the way people do when patience begins to thin. She scrolled through the guest list once more, slower this time, then shook her head. Sir, I'm quite certain. The small group of onlookers near the rail had grown slightly larger. Someone whispered something that triggered a quiet ripple of laughter. Another guest raised his phone higher, curiosity replacing subtlety. Lindsay noticed the attention and straightened her posture, determined not to look uncertain in front of the crowd. This event is invitation only, she repeated. The man finally looked directly at her. Not with anger, not with embarrassment, just steady focus, like someone studying a puzzle that would eventually solve itself. I understand, he replied calmly. A few feet away, one of the deckhands near the railing leaned toward another crew member and murmured something under his breath while glancing down at the dock. The second deckhand frowned slightly, as if trying to place a face he might have seen before somewhere else. Lindsay didn't notice them. Her attention was still fixed on the man standing at the ramp, who seemed entirely too comfortable for someone she believed had just been denied entry to one of the most exclusive parties on the bay. She gestured lightly toward the walkway behind him. There are plenty of public events happening along the marina tonight, she said. But this one isn't open to walk-ins. The words hung in the humid night air, polite on the surface, but edged with a quiet certainty that she had already decided how this encounter would end. A murmur spread through the nearby guests as if the crowd had collectively leaned forward in anticipation of what the man might do next. Would he argue? Would he leave? Would he try to explain himself? The man remained still for another moment, looking past Lindsay toward the deck, where music and laughter continued as though the world had not paused at the bottom of that ramp. Then slowly, almost casually, he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and pulled out his phone. The screen lit his face briefly in the dim marina light. Lindsay crossed her arms lightly, convinced she had seen the final act of this little misunderstanding before. People who didn't belong often made phone calls hoping someone important might rescue them from embarrassment. What she didn't know, what none of the guests whispering along the railing knew, was that the quiet call about to happen on that dock would send a ripple across the entire yacht before the night was over. The screen of the phone glowed softly in the humid marina air as the man lifted it to his ear, and for a moment Lindsay Parker felt a quiet flicker of satisfaction, because she believed she already understood how the next few minutes would unfold. People who tried to enter places where they did not belong often made calls exactly like this. They would step aside, whisper urgently to someone on the other end, and then either leave embarrassed or attempt to convince the staff that a mistake had been made. Lindsay had seen it happen at private galas, charity dinners, rooftop parties, and luxury launches across Miami. Status events created invisible borders, and her job was to guard them. So when the man calmly waited for the call to connect, Lindsay shifted her weight slightly and crossed her arms with the practiced patience of someone who believed she had already reached the final page of the story. But the man standing on the dock did not look embarrassed. He did not glance nervously at the growing group of spectators. He did not move away from the ramp. Instead, he looked back out toward the yacht again, as if the entire situation unfolding around him were only a temporary delay rather than a rejection. The phone connected with a soft click. The man spoke quietly, his voice steady and unhurried. Daniel, he said, I have arrived at the marina. There was a brief pause as the voice on the other end answered. From where Lindsay stood, she could not hear the response clearly, only the faint murmur of someone speaking through the phone speaker. The man nodded once, as if confirming something obvious. Yes, he continued. I am standing at the boarding ramp. Another pause followed. Lindsay noticed that a few more guests along the rail had turned their attention fully toward the scene now. What had begun as a small interruption had quietly grown into the most interesting moment of the evening. A man in a gray suit leaned against the polished rail of the yacht, watching the exchange with mild curiosity while holding a glass of sparkling water. Two women beside him whispered to each other while pretending to admire the skyline. Even one of the bartenders on the lower deck had slowed his movements while polishing a glass, glancing occasionally toward the ramp as if sensing that something unusual was unfolding. The man continued speaking into the phone. "Yes," he said calmly. "I understand." His tone remained polite, almost casual, but the way he held the phone suggested he was not asking for permission or assistance. He was simply reporting a situation. Lindsay tilted her head slightly. She had expected nervous explanation by now, or perhaps a frustrated argument. Instead, there was only quiet confirmation, as if the man were discussing a minor scheduling detail rather than being denied entry to a private event. The breeze from the bay shifted slightly, carrying the sound of laughter from the upper deck and rustling the small row of signal flags along the stern. The yacht rocked gently against the dock, its polished hull reflecting streaks of city light across the dark water. Lindsay felt the eyes of the nearby guests on her now as much as on the man with the phone. That awareness made her posture straighten even further. "Appear confident," she reminded herself. "When people sense hesitation, they begin to question authority." She cleared her throat lightly and spoke again, her voice firm but controlled. "Sir, if you do not have confirmation of your invitation, I am going to need you to step away from the ramp so we can allow other guests to board." The man lifted one finger slightly toward her without looking away from the phone, a small gesture asking for one more moment. Lindsay blinked once in surprise. Very few people had ever responded to her instructions like that. Most guests either complied immediately or protested loudly. This man had simply paused her with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to finishing conversations before addressing interruptions. The voice from the phone spoke again, this time slightly louder. Lindsay could not hear the exact words, but the tone sounded alert now, almost startled. The man on the dock gave a short, quiet laugh. "No," he replied softly. "That will not be necessary." The answer seemed to reassure the voice on the other end, because the conversation ended a few seconds later. The man lowered the phone and slipped it back into the inside pocket of his blazer. For a brief moment the dock returned to silence, except for the soft lapping of water against the marina pylons. Lindsay opened her mouth to repeat her request that he step aside, but something in the man's expression caused her to hesitate. It was not arrogance. It was not defiance. It was simply patience. The kind of patience people carry when they know the situation is about to change without them needing to force it. Lindsay felt a strange flicker of irritation at that calm. "You are holding up the entrance," she said. Her voice was still polite, but now it carried the faint edge of someone trying to maintain control of a moment that was becoming less predictable. Several guests near the rail leaned forward slightly. One of them lifted a phone openly now, recording without pretending otherwise. Lindsay noticed the camera and felt a sudden urge to end the situation quickly. Public scenes at private events rarely looked good on video, even when staff were technically correct. "Sir," she repeated, "I am asking you to move away from the ramp." The man finally looked directly at her again. His eyes were steady, thoughtful, almost sympathetic. For a brief moment Lindsay had the strange sensation that he was not annoyed with her, but quietly evaluating the entire situation around them. Then he spoke. "I understand your concern," he said calmly. His voice was deeper than Lindsay expected, smooth and unhurried like someone accustomed to speaking in boardrooms where people listened carefully before responding. "However," he continued, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Lindsay felt the tension along the dock tighten slightly, as if the surrounding guests sensed that the conversation had reached an important point. She glanced again at the tablet in her hand, scrolling once more through the guest list just to confirm what she had already seen. The name still was not there in the section she expected. No misunderstanding appeared on the screen. The list was clear. "I am afraid the guest list is correct," she replied. "If your name is not here, then you are not scheduled to attend this event." The man nodded slowly, as if acknowledging her logic. "That is possible," he said. His calm agreement caught Lindsay off guard again. She had expected resistance, perhaps even frustration. Instead, he seemed almost curious about how far the situation might go before resolving itself. One of the deckhands along the rail shifted closer now, whispering quietly to another crew member while keeping his eyes fixed on the man standing at the ramp. The second crew member frowned slightly, studying the man's face more carefully, as though a memory were slowly forming. Lindsay did not notice them. Her attention was fixed entirely on the man who still had not stepped aside. "Sir," she said more firmly now, "I need you to move away from the entrance." The man glanced once more toward the deck of the yacht, where music continued drifting across the water and guests continued gathering beneath the warm lights. Then he returned his gaze to Lindsay. "I appreciate your professionalism this evening," he said. The statement sounded genuine rather than sarcastic, which made Lindsay hesitate again. But his next words carried a quiet weight that shifted the atmosphere along the dock almost instantly. "You are doing exactly what you were instructed to do," he continued. Lindsay frowned slightly, unsure where the sentence was going. "However," he added calmly, "the problem is that the instructions you received are incomplete." The nearby guests exchanged glances. Even the bartender on the lower deck paused again, holding a glass mid-polish while watching the exchange unfold. Lindsay felt the situation beginning to slide outside the predictable pattern she had expected. "Incomplete instructions," she repeated carefully. "What does that mean?" The man's expression remained calm as he answered. "It means that the person responsible for this yacht was expected to arrive tonight without an entourage," he said. Lindsay felt the faintest flicker of uncertainty move through her chest. The surrounding guests leaned closer, sensing that the quiet tension that had begun at the ramp was about to turn into something far more interesting than the party itself. The words hung in the warm night air for a moment longer than anyone expected, and for the first time since the interaction began, Lindsay Parker felt something unfamiliar move through her confidence, a small crack of uncertainty that she tried to hide behind the professional posture she had practiced at dozens of events before. The man standing at the ramp had not raised his voice, had not argued, and had not tried to force his way onto the yacht. Instead, he had simply spoken with the calm certainty of someone who understood the entire situation far better than the people surrounding him. Lindsay glanced down again at the glowing tablet in her hand, scrolling through the guest list once more even though she had already checked it twice. The names on the screen remained exactly the same. Venture capitalist from California, a technology founder from Austin, a professional athlete from New York, several investment groups, and a few well-known social media personalities whose attendance had helped make the event appear even more exclusive. The list looked complete, organized alphabetically with clear digital confirmations beside each name. Yet none of it explained the quiet confidence of the man still standing on the dock. Around them, the mood on the yacht had shifted almost completely. Conversations had slowed. Laughter had faded into whispers. The soft music drifting across the deck continued playing, but now it sounded distant, like background noise in a room where something more important had suddenly captured everyone's attention. A guest in a navy blue suit leaned slightly closer to the railing, lowering his voice as he spoke to the woman beside him. "I think something interesting is happening down there," he said quietly. She nodded, already holding her phone at chest level, recording without drawing attention to it. Another guest further along the rail murmured something similar, and soon several more phones were quietly pointed toward the boarding ramp where Lindsay and the mysterious man faced each other beneath the glow of the dock lights. Lindsay felt the attention gathering like a spotlight she had not asked for. Public attention at private events could be dangerous. It could turn simple misunderstandings into viral moments within minutes. Her job was to prevent exactly that kind of situation from happening. She cleared her throat slightly, steadying her voice before speaking again. "I am sure there must be some confusion," she said carefully. "If you can provide the name under which the invitation was issued, I will be happy to confirm it." The man watched her with the same patient expression. For a moment he did not answer. Instead, he glanced slowly along the length of the yacht, as if admiring its design, the curved lines of the upper deck, the glass railings that reflected the city lights, and the polished teak floors that gleamed beneath the golden party lights. It was a beautiful vessel, almost 120 feet long with 3 levels of decks, a private lounge area toward the bow, and an open entertainment space near the stern where guests were now gathering with drinks in hand. The yacht had been rented for the night as the centerpiece of the event, a symbol of luxury meant to impress investors and potential business partners. The man's eyes moved across the structure with a quiet familiarity that Lindsay did not notice. Finally, he looked back at her and answered. "The name is Adrian Colebrook," he said. The name did not immediately register with Lindsay. She lowered her gaze to the tablet again and began scrolling slowly through the guest list. The screen reflected faintly in her eyes as she moved past each letter of the alphabet. Anderson, Bennett, Collins, Diaz, Evans. Her finger slowed as she reached the section where the name should have appeared if it were there. She paused. The list remained unchanged. She searched once more, this time typing the name directly into the digital search bar at the top of the screen. The tablet processed the request for a moment and then displayed a simple result. No match found. Lindsay lifted her head again, the professional smile returning to her face, although it was slightly tighter now. "I am sorry," she said, "but that name does not appear on the guest list for tonight's event." The man did not look surprised. In fact, his expression suggested that he had expected exactly that response. "That is not unusual," he replied calmly. Lindsay blinked once, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. "Not unusual," she repeated. Adrian nodded slightly. "Large events sometimes have incomplete lists," he explained. "Invitations are distributed through multiple teams, and occasionally the information does not reach the person responsible for managing the entrance." His tone remained polite, but there was something unmistakably deliberate about his explanation. It was not defensive. It was instructional, like a teacher explaining a detail that others had overlooked. Several guests along the rail exchanged glances again. One of the deckhands leaned closer to another crew member and whispered something quietly. The second crew member's eyes widened slightly, as if a memory had suddenly clicked into place. Lindsay remained focused on the man in front of her. "If your name is not on the list," she said, "then unfortunately I cannot allow you to board the yacht." Adrian studied her for a moment, and for the first time there was a faint hint of amusement in his expression. "That is a reasonable policy," he said. Lindsay felt the faint irritation return. She had expected frustration or embarrassment by now, not agreement. The calmness of the man was beginning to feel almost deliberate, as though he were observing the situation unfold rather than participating in it. Then Adrian reached slowly into the inside pocket of his blazer again. Lindsay instinctively straightened, expecting him to produce some form of identification or invitation card. Instead, he removed a small leather wallet and opened it briefly before holding out a single card between two fingers. The card itself was simple, matte black with clean silver lettering across the surface. Lindsay hesitated before taking it. When she finally did, the card felt heavier than she expected, as though it were made from metal rather than paper. She glanced down at the engraving and read the name silently. Adrian Colebrook. Beneath the name were 2 lines of smaller text identifying a company she recognized immediately. Colebrook Maritime Holdings. Lindsay's breath paused for a fraction of a second. She knew that name. Anyone working around luxury events near the marina had heard it before. Colebrook Maritime was one of the largest private investors in high-end vessels along the East Coast, known for purchasing and restoring luxury yachts for private clients and corporate partnerships. She had heard the name mentioned during planning meetings for other events, always spoken with the kind of quiet respect reserved for companies that operated far above the level of ordinary event planning. But Lindsay's mind resisted the conclusion forming in front of her. The man standing on the dock did not look like the type of executive she had imagined when hearing that name. Adrian watched the realization flicker behind her eyes without interrupting her thoughts. The surrounding guests leaned even closer to the railing now, sensing that the quiet moment at the bottom of the ramp was approaching a turning point. Lindsay looked up slowly from the card. The confident certainty she had carried earlier in the evening had begun to soften, replaced by a careful uncertainty she could not quite explain. "You are saying that you represent Colebrook Maritime Holdings," she said cautiously. Adrian gave a small nod. "That is correct," he replied. Lindsay glanced once more at the yacht behind her, then back at the card in her hand. Her voice lowered slightly as she asked the question that had suddenly become impossible to ignore. "And what exactly is your connection to this vessel tonight?" Adrian's answer came with the same calm clarity that had defined every word he had spoken since arriving at the dock. "I believe the simplest way to explain it," he said quietly, "is that this yacht belongs to my company." For a moment, the marina seemed to hold its breath as Lindsay Parker stared at the black metal card resting in her hand and tried to reconcile the calm man standing in front of her with the name engraved across its surface. The golden lights from the yacht reflected softly against the card, and the polished letters spelling Adrian Colebrook glimmered with a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. Lindsay had spent years working events along the Miami waterfront, and certain names had a way of circulating through the service industry like quiet legends. Colebrook Maritime Holdings was one of those names. The company had purchased several luxury vessels across the Atlantic coast over the past decade, restoring them into floating investments used for corporate retreats, elite gatherings, and private partnerships. It was not the kind of company that hosted ordinary parties, and it certainly was not the kind of name Lindsay expected to see on a card held by someone she had just asked to step away from the entrance. She looked from the card to Adrian and back again, her mind searching for a mistake somewhere in the situation. Around them, the energy of the evening had shifted even more noticeably. Guests along the rail were no longer pretending to look elsewhere. The curiosity that had begun as quiet whispers had now turned into open observation. Phones remained raised. Conversations had slowed. The music still drifted across the deck, but now it felt like background noise to the quiet tension building at the bottom of the ramp. Lindsay cleared her throat gently as she tried to maintain the professional composure she had practiced through hundreds of events before. She handed the card back carefully. "If that is the case," she said cautiously, "then perhaps you are part of the ownership group involved with tonight's event." Adrian accepted the card and slipped it back into his wallet with the same calm movements he had shown from the beginning. "That is one way to describe it," he replied. His voice remained steady and respectful, but there was something unmistakable in his tone now. It was not pride or arrogance. It was simply certainty. Lindsay felt the first real wave of unease move through her thoughts. Because if what he was saying was true, then the situation unfolding on the dock was no longer a simple misunderstanding at the entrance of a private event. It was something far more serious. She glanced toward the upper deck instinctively, searching for the event coordinator who had organized the guest list for the evening. The coordinator, a tall man named Richard who had spent most of the evening greeting high-profile guests near the champagne bar, was currently laughing with a group of investors near the bow of the yacht. He had not yet noticed the growing crowd of attention gathering at the gangway. Lindsay turned back to Adrian, her voice quieter now. "This yacht was reserved for tonight's celebration by the Harbor Circle Investment Group," she explained carefully. Adrian nodded slightly. "Yes," he said, "I am aware of that." Lindsay felt the situation slipping further from the clear boundaries she had been given during the event briefing. She had been told exactly who was hosting the party, exactly who had organized the invitations, and exactly which names would appear on the tablet she carried. Everything about the system had been designed to prevent confusion. And yet here was a man calmly suggesting that the yacht itself belonged to a company connected to his name. One of the deckhands along the rail had now moved several steps closer to the ramp. His eyes studied Adrian carefully, as if he were trying to confirm a thought forming in his mind. Another crew member leaned toward him and whispered something quietly. Adrian noticed the exchange, but said nothing. He simply waited. Lindsay inhaled slowly, gathering her professionalism before speaking again. "I would like to clarify something before we continue," she said. Adrian gave a small nod indicating that he was listening. Lindsay continued, "If your company owns this vessel, then it would have been arranged through a rental agreement for tonight's event. That means the guest list would still be managed by the hosting organization." Adrian listened without interrupting. When she finished, he answered calmly. "That is generally how these events work," he said. Lindsay felt a small wave of relief that he seemed to agree with her explanation. But Adrian's next sentence carried a quiet detail that shifted the conversation again. "However," he continued, "the ownership of the yacht does not change simply because it is being used for an event." Several guests along the rail exchanged glances at that statement. One man in a gray jacket lowered his drink slowly, watching the conversation unfold with growing interest. Lindsay felt the attention pressing against her now like the heat of the dock lights. She realized that the entire entrance of the yacht had effectively become the center of the evening. Adrian remained relaxed. The breeze from the bay moved gently through the marina, carrying the faint sound of water tapping against the hull of the yacht. Lindsay considered his words carefully before responding. "I understand that ownership does not change," she said, "but the access to the event is still controlled by the host organization." Adrian nodded once more. "That is correct," he replied. Lindsay waited, expecting him to continue. Adrian's eyes moved briefly toward the upper deck again, where the lights glowed warmly against the night sky. Then he looked back at her and added quietly, "But that arrangement does not normally prevent the owner of the vessel from boarding his own property." The sentence landed softly but carried the weight of a stone dropped into still water. The guests nearest the railing reacted immediately. One woman covered her mouth with a surprised laugh. Another guest murmured something that sounded suspiciously like, "Did he just say owner?" Lindsay felt her pulse quicken slightly. Her mind raced through every detail she remembered from the planning meetings earlier that week. The yacht had been listed as privately secured for the evening through a corporate contract. She had never been told anything about the owner attending the event personally. That detail had never appeared in the instructions. She looked again at Adrian, studying him more carefully now. The simple black blazer, the dark jeans, no visible luxury watch, no entourage, none of the signals she had been trained to associate with billionaire investors or corporate founders. Yet the calm confidence in his posture had never wavered. And suddenly Lindsay realized something unsettling. He had never once tried to convince her that he belonged there. He had simply waited for the situation to reveal itself. One of the deckhands finally spoke from the rail above. "Excuse me," he called down carefully. Lindsay and Adrian both looked up toward him. The crew member hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Are you Mr. Colebrook?" Adrian looked up at him calmly. "Yes," he replied. The deckhand's expression changed immediately. His posture straightened almost instinctively. Lindsay noticed the shift and felt her uncertainty deepen. The crew member turned to the other deckhand beside him and whispered something urgently. The second crew member nodded quickly and disappeared toward the upper deck, where the event coordinator was still speaking with guests near the bar. Lindsay returned her attention to Adrian. "I was not informed that the owner of the yacht would be arriving tonight," she admitted quietly. Adrian's response remained patient. "That is understandable," he said. Lindsay studied his face again, and for the first time since the evening began she noticed something she had overlooked earlier. He was not angry. He was not embarrassed. He simply seemed curious about how long it would take for the situation to resolve itself. The nearby guests were no longer hiding their interest. Several people had now moved closer to the rail, leaning slightly forward to watch the conversation unfolding beneath them. A quiet ripple of anticipation moved through the crowd as the second deckhand returned with the event coordinator walking quickly behind him. The tall coordinator slowed when he reached the rail and looked down toward the dock. His eyes moved from Lindsay to Adrian, and the moment he recognized the man standing at the bottom of the ramp, the confident smile he had been wearing all evening disappeared completely. The moment Richard saw the man standing at the bottom of the ramp, the color seemed to drain from his face as if someone had quietly dimmed the lights behind his confidence. For the past hour he had been moving across the deck with effortless charm, greeting investors, introducing business partners, and raising glasses of champagne in celebration of what he believed would be one of the most successful networking events Harbor Circle had hosted all year. But now his posture stiffened, his shoulders tightening as recognition struck him with a clarity that erased the relaxed smile he had been wearing all evening. Several guests standing nearby noticed the sudden shift immediately. One of the investors who had been speaking with him leaned slightly closer and followed Richard's gaze toward the gangway below. Down on the dock, beneath the warm glow of the marina lights, Adrian Colebrook stood calmly beside the ramp exactly where Lindsay Parker had asked him to step aside minutes earlier. Adrian had not moved. His hands rested loosely at his sides. His posture relaxed, as if the entire situation unfolding around him were simply another quiet observation rather than a confrontation. The breeze from the water moved gently through the marina again, carrying the scent of salt and polished wood across the deck. Conversations that had resumed moments earlier slowed once more as more guests noticed Richard staring toward the entrance. Someone whispered a question. Another guest lifted a phone again, sensing that something far more important than the party itself was about to happen. Richard exhaled slowly as he walked toward the railing. Each step felt heavier than the last. From the moment the deckhand had whispered the name into his ear, a single realization had been echoing in his mind. Adrian Colebrook was not just another investor connected to the yacht. Adrian Colebrook was the reason the yacht existed in the Harbor Circle portfolio at all. 2 years earlier, Colebrook Maritime Holdings had purchased the vessel from a European investment group and restored it completely, transforming it into one of the most recognizable luxury ships along the East Coast. Harbor Circle had secured permission to use the yacht for tonight's celebration only after weeks of negotiations with Colebrook Maritime's management office. Richard had assumed the arrangement would remain entirely corporate. He had never imagined that the man responsible for the vessel might decide to attend the event himself. From the rail he looked down again, and this time Adrian looked up and met his gaze. There was no anger in Adrian's expression, no accusation, only quiet awareness. It was the expression of someone who already understood exactly what Richard had just realized. The silence between them lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer to the guests watching from both levels of the yacht. Lindsay Parker stood at the ramp with the tablet still in her hands, unaware of the full weight of the moment unfolding above her. She noticed Richard approaching the railing, but had not yet seen the change in his expression. Richard placed both hands lightly on the glass rail and leaned forward just enough for his voice to carry down to the dock. "Mr. Colebrook," he said carefully. Adrian nodded once in acknowledgement. "Good evening, Richard," he replied calmly. The sound of his name spoken so casually sent another ripple through the small crowd gathered near the rail. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. The man in the gray suit lowered his drink slowly, clearly realizing that the situation was no longer a simple misunderstanding. Lindsay turned toward the voice above her, confusion appearing briefly across her face as she looked from Richard back to Adrian. Richard straightened slightly, forcing his professional composure back into place even though his thoughts were racing. "Mr. Colebrook," he continued, "I was not aware that you would be joining us tonight." Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. "That was the intention," he said. A quiet murmur moved through the nearby guests again. Lindsay felt her grip tighten slightly on the tablet as the conversation above her began revealing pieces of a situation she had not expected. Richard descended the steps from the deck with surprising speed, his polished shoes tapping softly against the metal stairs leading down to the gangway. Each step carried him closer to the entrance where the evening's misunderstanding had unfolded. When he reached the dock, he paused for a moment beside Lindsay, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Lindsay," he said quietly, "you may want to step back from the ramp for a moment." Lindsay looked at him with confusion. "I was simply following the guest list," she replied softly. Richard gave a small nod, acknowledging her effort while gently reaching out to take the tablet from her hands. "I know," he said. Adrian watched the exchange calmly. Around them the atmosphere had shifted completely. The curiosity that had begun as quiet whispers had now become open fascination. Several guests had moved closer to the rail above the entrance, leaning forward to observe every detail of the conversation unfolding below them. The deckhand who had recognized Adrian earlier now stood with perfect posture near the gangway, clearly aware that something significant was happening. Richard turned toward Adrian with a careful expression that balanced respect and embarrassment. "Mr. Colebrook," he began, "I would like to apologize for the confusion at the entrance." Adrian raised one hand slightly, stopping the sentence before it continued. "There is no need to rush into apologies," he said calmly. Richard hesitated. Adrian's tone remained composed, but the quiet authority behind it carried across the dock. Lindsay watched the exchange in growing disbelief as the reality of the situation slowly assembled in her mind. She had spent the past several minutes insisting that Adrian Colebrook could not board the yacht because his name did not appear on the guest list. And now the very person responsible for organizing the entire event was standing beside her addressing him with careful respect. Richard cleared his throat gently before continuing. "The vessel belongs to your company," he said. "We are grateful for the opportunity to host tonight's gathering here." Adrian nodded once. "I am glad the yacht could be useful," he replied. The simplicity of the statement carried a quiet weight that made several guests along the rail shift uncomfortably. It was suddenly obvious that the man they had watched being questioned at the entrance had never been an outsider at all. Lindsay felt the heat rise slightly in her face as the truth settled over her like a slow-moving tide. Her mind replayed the moment she had first stopped Adrian at the ramp, the confident way she had told him the event was private, the calm way he had simply asked her to check the list again. Adrian glanced briefly at the yacht behind Richard, the warm lights reflecting across the water like floating stars. "It looks like the evening has begun successfully," he said. Richard nodded quickly. Yes, he replied. The guests have been enjoying the event. Adrian looked back at him with the same calm expression he had carried since arriving at the dock. That is good to hear, he said. For several seconds neither man spoke again. The quiet pause stretched across the dock while dozens of curious eyes watched from the deck above. Lindsay shifted slightly beside the ramp, unsure whether she should speak or remain silent. The breeze moved through the marina once more, gently rocking the yacht against its moorings. Finally, Adrian glanced toward Lindsay again. She met his gaze, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful uncertainty. Adrian's voice remained steady when he spoke. You were doing your job, he said. Lindsay blinked once, surprised by the calmness of his tone. I did not recognize you, she admitted quietly. Adrian nodded slightly. That happens more often than you might expect, he replied. The statement carried a quiet depth that several guests seemed to notice immediately. Richard looked from Lindsay back to Adrian, clearly aware that the moment had become larger than a simple apology. He gestured toward the ramp with a respectful motion. Mr. Colebrook, he said carefully, the yacht is ready whenever you would like to come aboard. For several seconds after Richard's invitation, the dock remained quiet except for the gentle rhythm of water brushing against the hull of the yacht. Adrian Colebrook did not move immediately. Instead, he looked up toward the deck where dozens of guests had gathered along the glass railing, their attention fixed on the scene unfolding below. The golden party lights reflected in their glasses and jewelry, but the expressions on their faces were no longer casual. Curiosity had turned into something else entirely. Some looked surprised. Some looked uncomfortable. Others simply looked fascinated by the quiet reversal taking place at the entrance of the yacht. Adrian had seen that look many times in his life. It was the look people gave when reality quietly contradicted their first assumption. Richard still stood beside the ramp, one hand gesturing politely toward the gangway. Lindsay Parker remained just a step behind him, her posture stiff, her thoughts racing through the events of the past several minutes. The tablet she had used to guard the guest list now rested against her side like an object that had suddenly lost its authority. Adrian finally took a slow step forward, stopping just at the base of the ramp where the polished metal handrails reflected the dock lights in thin silver lines. Before stepping onto the gangway, he paused again and looked at Lindsay. She met his eyes with a mixture of embarrassment and caution. The earlier certainty in her voice had disappeared completely, replaced by the careful quiet of someone who now understood how much she had not known. Adrian spoke gently, his tone calm enough that the nearby guests could still hear it clearly. You were protecting the entrance, he said. Lindsay nodded slightly, unsure whether she should respond. That was my responsibility tonight, she replied softly. Adrian gave a small acknowledging nod. Responsibility is important, he said. His words were simple, but the way he spoke them carried a quiet gravity that made several of the guests along the rail lean forward again to listen. Lindsay lowered her gaze briefly before looking back at him. I should have asked more questions, she said. Adrian's expression did not change. Sometimes people do not ask questions because they believe they already know the answers, he replied. The statement settled over the dock with a calm weight that no one present could misunderstand. The breeze shifted again across the marina, lifting the edge of Lindsay's hair and carrying the distant sound of traffic from the city beyond the water. For a moment no one spoke. Richard watched the exchange carefully, clearly aware that the moment had become something larger than a simple correction at the entrance. Adrian then turned his attention back toward the ramp. The yacht behind Richard stretched across the dark water like a floating city of glass and light, the music from the upper deck drifting softly down to the dock. It had taken years of work for Adrian to reach the position he now held, years of long negotiations, investments, and quiet decisions that had gradually built Colebrook Maritime Holdings into one of the most influential luxury vessel companies in the country. And yet moments like this still appeared in unexpected places. Moments when a person was judged before being recognized. Moments when silence revealed more about a room than arguments ever could. Adrian placed one hand lightly on the metal rail and stepped onto the gangway. The movement was simple, but the reaction from the deck above was immediate. Several guests straightened their posture instinctively. Conversation stopped entirely. One of the bartenders near the lower deck entrance paused while placing glasses on a tray, watching Adrian approach with a focused expression. Richard stepped aside respectfully, allowing Adrian to pass. As Adrian moved up the ramp, the quiet tension of the evening shifted into something closer to anticipation. People were no longer watching a misunderstanding unfold. They were watching the arrival of the man whose company owned the very yacht beneath their feet. Adrian reached the top of the gangway and stepped onto the polished teak deck. The warm lights reflected across the wood like a soft, golden glow, and the music from the speakers seemed to fade for a moment as the nearby guests realized that the center of the evening had quietly changed. Richard followed a step behind him, clearing his throat gently as he addressed the crowd closest to the entrance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a careful smile, "please allow me to welcome Mr. Adrian Colebrook this evening." The reaction was immediate but subtle. A few guests applauded softly. Others exchanged surprised glances as they processed the name they had just heard. One of the investors who had been leaning against the rail earlier lifted his eyebrows in disbelief and whispered something to the woman beside him. She nodded slowly, her expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. Adrian acknowledged the small welcome with a simple nod before looking out across the deck. The party stretched across 2 levels of the yacht, with guests gathered around small tables, conversation groups forming near the railings, and the soft glow of decorative lights reflecting across the water beyond the marina. It was exactly the kind of event Harbor Circle specialized in organizing. Elegant, exclusive, carefully designed to impress potential partners. Adrian walked a few steps farther onto the deck before stopping near the rail. From there he could see the dock below where Lindsay still stood beside the ramp, watching the scene unfold with quiet reflection. Adrian's eyes moved across the faces of the guests around him. Some looked eager to introduce themselves. Others looked uncertain, perhaps wondering if they had witnessed something uncomfortable earlier at the entrance. Adrian had long ago learned that moments like this often revealed more about a room than any formal meeting ever could. He rested one hand lightly on the rail, looking out across the dark water for a brief moment before speaking again. "I hope everyone is enjoying the evening," he said calmly. The guests nearest him responded with polite agreement, several raising their glasses slightly in acknowledgement. Richard stepped forward beside him, clearly relieved that the situation had shifted toward a more comfortable tone. "The event has been excellent so far," he said. "Your yacht has been a remarkable setting for the gathering." Adrian glanced briefly around the deck again. "I am glad to hear that," he replied. A small group of investors began moving closer now, sensing an opportunity to introduce themselves. One of them extended his hand politely. "Mr. Colebrook, it is an honor to meet you," he said. Adrian shook his hand with an easy smile before greeting several others who had joined the circle. The earlier tension at the entrance had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something quieter, a moment that many of the guests would remember long after the evening ended. Below the deck, Lindsay remained on the dock beside the ramp, her mind replaying every detail of the interaction that had brought them to this point. The marina lights reflected across the water in slow-moving patterns, and the music from the yacht drifted down again with a relaxed rhythm. Lindsay looked up toward the deck where Adrian now stood speaking calmly with the guests who only minutes earlier had been watching him from a distance with curiosity. She realized that nothing about his demeanor had changed from the moment he first arrived. He had been calm then. He was calm now. The difference had never been his behavior. The difference had been the assumptions made before anyone knew who he was. On the upper deck, Adrian listened patiently as another guest introduced himself, the quiet confidence in his posture unchanged. The evening continued around him, but the story of how he had arrived had already begun spreading through the crowd in low whispers carried from one conversation to the next. The soft rhythm of conversation slowly returned across the deck, but the atmosphere of the evening had changed in a way that no music or laughter could fully disguise. Word had already begun spreading quietly from group to group, carried through whispered explanations and raised eyebrows. The story was simple enough that it traveled quickly. The man who had been stopped at the entrance of the yacht was the man whose company owned it. Each time the detail passed from one guest to another, the reaction was the same. Surprise first, then an uncomfortable pause as the earlier scene at the gangway replayed in their minds. Adrian Colebrook stood near the rail of the upper deck, listening politely as a pair of investors introduced themselves and explained how they had been hoping to meet him during the evening. His posture remained relaxed, his tone calm and respectful as he answered their questions about maritime investment and the future of private vessel partnerships. Nothing about his demeanor suggested that anything unusual had happened before he stepped aboard. Yet several guests standing nearby could not help glancing toward the gangway from time to time, as though the memory of the moment was still lingering in the warm night air. Richard remained close to Adrian, careful not to interrupt, but clearly attentive to every word exchanged. The earlier tension at the entrance had left him quietly unsettled. As the event coordinator responsible for organizing the entire evening, he knew how quickly a moment like that could spread beyond the yacht if someone decided to share a recording online. Several guests had been holding their phones when the conversation unfolded at the ramp. That reality had not escaped his thoughts. Still, Adrian did not appear interested in turning the situation into a public spectacle. Instead, he listened patiently to the guests around him, occasionally nodding as someone spoke about business ventures or investment opportunities along the East Coast. A tall man with silver hair finally asked the question that had clearly been on several minds. "Mr. Colebrook," he said with careful curiosity, "did you arrive alone tonight?" Adrian smiled slightly. "Yes," he replied. "I prefer to travel quietly when possible." The investors exchanged quick glances before one of them chuckled softly. "That certainly explains why no one recognized you at the entrance," he said. Adrian's expression remained calm. "Recognition is an interesting thing," he answered. "People often believe they recognize success by how it looks." The words were spoken gently, without accusation, but they carried enough, meaning that the small group around him fell quiet for a moment. From the lower level of the yacht, the sound of glassware clinking together rose as the bartender prepared another round of drinks. The party continued moving around Adrian, but the center of attention had shifted completely toward him now. Several more guests drifted closer, curious to hear the conversation. Down on the dock, Lindsay Parker remained near the base of the gangway where she had stood earlier in the evening. The marina lights reflected across the water in slow shimmering lines, and the distant skyline of Miami glowed against the horizon like a second city floating above the bay. Lindsay watched the movement of guests on the deck above, occasionally catching glimpses of Adrian as he spoke with the investors gathered around him. She replayed the entire encounter in her mind again and again, each detail becoming clearer now that she understood who he was. The calm way he had asked her to check the list again. The patience in his voice when she insisted his name was not there. The quiet certainty in his posture when he made the phone call. None of those moments had contained anger. None had contained embarrassment. He had simply waited. Lindsay exhaled slowly, realizing how easily assumptions could shape a moment before facts had the chance to speak. One of the deckhands who had recognized Adrian earlier walked down the steps toward the dock, pausing beside Lindsay with a respectful nod. "Quite a night," he said quietly. Lindsay gave a small nod in return. "I did not know who he was," she admitted. The deckhand leaned against the rail for a moment, watching the lights ripple across the water. "Most people do not," he said. "That is part of what makes him interesting." Lindsay glanced toward him with curiosity. "You have met him before?" she asked. The deckhand nodded. "A few months ago when the yacht was being prepared for this season. He came down to inspect the restoration work himself." Lindsay frowned slightly, surprised. He did not bring a large team with him. No photographers. No reporters. He simply walked through the vessel with the engineers and asked questions about every system on board. Lindsay looked back toward the deck again. "And no one recognized him tonight," she said quietly. The deckhand smiled faintly. "Some of the crew did," he replied. "But we were waiting to see how things would unfold." Lindsay considered that answer carefully. The moment had unfolded exactly as it had because no one had interfered early enough to change it. On the upper deck, Adrian was now speaking with a woman who managed a technology investment firm based in San Francisco. She described a project involving coastal transportation networks and asked whether Colebrook Maritime had ever considered partnerships in that sector. Adrian listened with interest, asking several thoughtful questions before offering his perspective on the logistics of marine infrastructure. The conversation moved easily, the earlier tension at the entrance now transformed into something almost symbolic. Several guests had already begun describing the moment as an example of quiet composure under pressure. Others simply admired the restraint Adrian had shown when he could have easily revealed his identity immediately. Richard watched the conversations unfold from a short distance away. The evening had regained its rhythm, but the lesson embedded within the earlier misunderstanding remained present in every quiet glance toward Adrian. Eventually, Adrian stepped away from the small circle of investors and walked toward the rail again, looking out across the dark water where the lights of the marina stretched toward the horizon. Richard approached him carefully. "Mr. Colebrook," he said softly, "I would like to thank you again for your patience earlier this evening." Adrian looked out at the water for a moment before answering. "Situations like that reveal interesting things," he said. Richard nodded slightly. "I hope it did not leave a negative impression of the event." Adrian turned his gaze back toward the deck where guests continued to mingle under the golden lights. "No," he replied calmly. "It simply reminded me how easily people decide who belongs somewhere before they actually know." Richard lowered his voice slightly. "Lindsay feels deeply embarrassed about what happened." Adrian nodded once. "She was following the information she had been given," he said. "That is rarely the real problem." Richard hesitated before asking the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment Adrian stepped aboard. "Then what is the real problem?" he asked quietly. Adrian looked back across the crowd of guests gathered on the deck. "Sometimes the problem is not the rules people follow," he answered. "Sometimes it is the assumptions people make before they check the facts." The music across the deck softened into a slow instrumental rhythm as the evening continued unfolding beneath the golden lights, but the atmosphere carried a quiet awareness that had not been there earlier. Conversations had resumed, glasses were being raised again, and laughter occasionally drifted across the rail toward the dark water of the marina. Yet beneath the elegance of the gathering there remained a subtle shift in perspective among many of the guests. The story of what had happened at the entrance had already traveled from one conversation to the next. Some guests described it with amusement, others with quiet embarrassment, but everyone seemed to understand that they had witnessed something more meaningful than a simple misunderstanding at a party. Adrian Colebrook stood near the rail once again, looking out over the water as the lights of Miami stretched across the horizon. The breeze from the bay moved gently through the open deck, carrying the distant scent of salt and the quiet hum of boats moving slowly through the marina channels. For a moment Adrian allowed himself to simply observe the evening without speaking. The reflections of the yacht lights shimmered across the water like ribbons of gold drifting through the darkness. The calm of the scene reminded him of something he had learned long before the success of Colebrook Maritime had turned his name into something people recognized in boardrooms and business headlines. Long before the yachts, long before the investment meetings and corporate partnerships, there had been moments not very different from the one that had unfolded at the entrance tonight. Moments when a person's presence in a room was quietly questioned before anyone asked who he was. A voice beside him gently interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Colebrook," a woman said politely. Adrian turned and saw the technology investor from San Francisco approaching him again, holding a glass of sparkling water and wearing a thoughtful expression. "I hope you do not mind me asking something more personal," she said. Adrian gave a small nod, inviting the question. She hesitated briefly before continuing. "When the hostess stopped you earlier, you did not seem surprised." Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering. "No," he said calmly. "I was not surprised." The woman studied his expression with curiosity. "Have you experienced that kind of situation often?" she asked. Adrian leaned lightly against the rail as the breeze moved across the deck again. "Sometimes success changes how people treat you," he replied slowly. "But assumptions about who belongs in certain spaces can remain the same for a very long time." The investor nodded thoughtfully, understanding the meaning behind his words even though he had spoken them without bitterness. Across the deck, another small group of guests had begun discussing the story as well. One of them gestured toward Adrian while speaking quietly to the others, clearly explaining what had happened earlier at the ramp. The expressions of the listeners shifted from curiosity to reflection as they processed the details. Down on the dock, Lindsay Parker still stood near the base of the gangway, watching the movement of the party above with a thoughtful silence. She had been offered the opportunity to return to the upper deck and continue her duties, but for a few minutes she had chosen to remain where she was. The marina lights reflected across the water around her, and the quiet rocking of the yacht against the dock created a soft rhythm in the night air. The deckhand who had spoken with her earlier returned again from the lower level, carrying a small equipment case. He paused beside her with a respectful nod. "Everything seems to have settled now," he said. Lindsay gave a small nod. "Yes," she replied. "It has." The deckhand rested the case on the dock and leaned lightly against the rail for a moment. He followed her gaze toward the upper deck, where Adrian stood speaking calmly with several guests. He handled that situation with a lot of patience, the deckhand said. Lindsay did not answer immediately. She was still replaying the moment when Adrian had first stepped onto the gangway after Richard invited him aboard. There had been no anger in his voice, no demand for recognition. Just the quiet confidence of someone who did not need to prove anything. Finally she spoke. I kept thinking he would argue with me, she admitted softly. Most people do when they believe they are being treated unfairly. The deckhand nodded slowly. He does not usually argue, he said. Lindsay glanced toward him with curiosity. Why not? She asked. The deckhand looked back toward the deck where Adrian was now shaking hands with another group of investors. Because he already knows who he is, he replied. Lindsay absorbed the words quietly. The explanation felt simple, yet it carried a weight. That lingered in her thoughts. On the upper deck, Adrian had moved slightly away from the crowd again, allowing the conversation around him to continue while he watched the movement of the marina beyond the yacht. Richard approached him once more, this time holding 2 glasses of water which he offered politely. Adrian accepted one with a nod of thanks. Richard hesitated before speaking again. Earlier you mentioned that situations like tonight reveal interesting things, he said. Adrian took a small sip of water before answering. They do, he replied. Richard looked out across the deck where guests continued mingling in small groups beneath the lights. What did this one reveal to you? He asked quietly. Adrian watched the reflections of the marina lights ripple across the water before answering. It reminded me of something my father once told me, he said. Richard listened carefully. Adrian continued in the same calm tone he had used throughout the evening. He said that the most revealing moments in life often happen when people think they are simply enforcing ordinary rules. Richard considered the thought for a moment. You mean when someone assumes the rules apply the same way to everyone? He asked. Adrian nodded slightly. Or when someone assumes they already understand the situation before asking a single question. The music on the deck shifted into another slow, instrumental melody as a waiter passed nearby, carrying a tray of drinks for the guests gathered near the bow. The evening had returned to its elegant rhythm, but the earlier moment at the entrance had left a quiet lesson woven into the atmosphere of the gathering. A few guests who had watched the entire scene unfold were now sharing the story with newcomers who had arrived later. Each retelling carried the same detail that made the moment unforgettable. The man who had been stopped at the entrance had turned out to be the owner of the yacht. Adrian finished his drink and placed the empty glass gently on a nearby table before looking back out at the water once more. The night air felt calm again. Yet somewhere in the quiet conversations around him, the meaning of the evening continued to unfold. The evening on the yacht continued to unfold beneath the warm glow of the deck lights. Yet the quiet lesson that had begun at the gangway had not faded from the atmosphere. Instead, it had settled into the rhythm of the conversations, now moving from one group to another across the polished teak floor. Guests stood in small circles discussing investments, technology ventures, and the shifting markets of coastal real estate, but every so often the story resurfaced again. Someone would lean slightly closer to another guest and say in a low voice that the owner of the yacht had been stopped at the entrance only an hour earlier. Each time the detail was repeated, the same reaction followed. A moment of disbelief, then a thoughtful pause as people reconsidered what they had witnessed. Adrian Colebrook stood near the bow of the upper deck now, where the view across Biscayne Bay stretched wide and open beneath the night sky. The skyline of Miami glowed in the distance like a line of glass towers floating above the water. Small lights from passing boats moved slowly across the dark surface of the bay, leaving thin ripples behind them that caught the reflection of the yacht's golden lights. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the rail while listening to a conversation between 2 investors discussing a new marina development plan for the Gulf Coast. His attention remained steady, yet his mind carried a quiet awareness of the evening's earlier moment. Situations like that were not new to him. They had happened in different forms throughout his life long before Colebrook Maritime had grown into the company it was now. Sometimes it happened in luxury hotels, sometimes in executive boardrooms, sometimes in places as simple as a restaurant entrance or an airport lounge. The details changed, but the pattern often felt familiar. Someone looked at him and made a quiet decision about where they believed he belonged. Across the deck, Richard watched Adrian with a thoughtful expression. As the event coordinator, he had spent most of the evening ensuring that every guest felt welcomed and that every detail of the celebration unfolded smoothly. Yet the moment at the entrance had remained in his thoughts like a quiet echo. It had not become a public confrontation. Adrian had not raised his voice or embarrassed anyone in front of the crowd. But the impact of the moment had been unmistakable. Richard had begun to realize that sometimes the calmest reactions carried the strongest message. A pair of venture capital partners approached Adrian again, eager to introduce themselves now that the story of the evening had spread throughout the yacht. One of them extended his hand with an enthusiastic smile. "Mr. Colebrook," he said, "I wanted to thank you personally for allowing Harbor Circle to use your vessel tonight." Adrian shook his hand politely. "I am glad it could serve a purpose for the event," he replied. The second partner leaned slightly forward, clearly curious about something. "If you do not mind me asking," he said carefully, "why did you wait so long to tell them who you were earlier?" Adrian smiled faintly, though his eyes remained thoughtful. "Because sometimes people learn more from a moment when you allow it to unfold naturally," he answered. The partners exchanged a quick glance before nodding slowly, understanding the meaning behind the answer. Not far from them, a group of guests had begun discussing the earlier scene as well. One of them, a woman who managed a private investment firm in Chicago, shook her head gently as she spoke. "I cannot imagine stopping someone so calmly dressed and assuming they did not belong," she said. A man beside her shrugged thoughtfully. "That is the strange thing about assumptions," he replied. "They feel obvious until the truth arrives." Down on the dock, Lindsay Parker finally stepped back onto the gangway, returning to the yacht after spending several quiet minutes reflecting beside the water. Her posture had regained its professionalism, but her thoughts had clearly changed since the beginning of the evening. As she reached the upper deck again, she paused for a moment, watching Adrian from a distance as he spoke with the group of investors near the bow. The calm way he carried himself was exactly the same as when she had first stopped him at the entrance. Nothing about him had changed. The only difference was that now everyone around him understood who he was. Lindsay walked slowly toward the service station where the bartenders were organizing fresh glasses. One of them glanced toward Adrian and then back to her. "Quite a memorable evening," he said quietly. Lindsay nodded. "Yes," she replied. "It will be difficult for anyone here to forget it." The bartender placed a tray of glasses on the counter and leaned slightly closer. "He handled that situation with remarkable composure," he said. Lindsay watched Adrian for another moment before answering. "That is what I keep thinking about," she said softly. "He never tried to prove anything." The bartender nodded slowly. "Some people do not need to prove who they are," he replied. "They simply allow time to reveal it." On the far side of the deck, the music shifted again, blending into a smooth instrumental melody that drifted across the open space. A waiter passed by offering drinks to the guests gathered near the rail, and the quiet buzz of conversation continued beneath the glow of the lights. Adrian eventually stepped away from the group of investors and returned once more to the rail overlooking the marina. Richard joined him again after finishing a conversation with another guest. "The evening has turned into quite a story," Richard said gently. Adrian looked out at the water, watching the reflection of the yacht lights ripple across the bay. "Stories have a way of forming around moments people do not expect," he replied. Richard nodded thoughtfully. "I believe many people here will remember the lesson behind this one," he said. Adrian rested both hands lightly on the rail. "Perhaps," he answered. "Or perhaps they will simply remember the surprise." Richard studied him for a moment before speaking again. "If you had wanted to, you could have revealed your identity the moment you arrived," he said. Adrian smiled slightly. "Yes," he replied. "That would have changed the entire situation immediately." Richard tilted his head with curiosity. "Why did you choose not to do that?" Adrian looked back toward the center of the deck where guests continued speaking in small groups, their voices rising and falling beneath the music. "Because sometimes it is more valuable to see how people behave when they believe no one important is watching," he said quietly. Richard considered the thought for a moment before nodding slowly. The marina breeze drifted across the deck again, and the lights of the yacht reflected gently across the dark water as the evening continued around them. The night had settled fully over the marina by the time the conversations on the yacht reached their most relaxed rhythm, and the lights of the city reflected across the water like scattered constellations drifting beneath the dark surface of Biscayne Bay. The music on the upper deck continued playing softly, a slow instrumental melody that blended with the quiet sound of glasses touching and conversations moving from one circle of guests to another. Yet even as the celebration unfolded with polished elegance, the earlier moment at the entrance had quietly transformed the atmosphere of the gathering. People were still talking about it, though now their voices carried a more thoughtful tone. The story had already traveled across the entire yacht. The man who owned the vessel had arrived alone and had been stopped at the entrance before anyone recognized him. Adrian Colebrook stood near the rail on the upper deck, looking out across the marina while the breeze moved gently through the open space around him. The lights from nearby boats created long ripples across the water, and the distant skyline glowed with the steady brilliance of a city that never truly slept. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the polished metal railing, watching the movement of the bay with the calm patience that had defined his presence throughout the entire evening. For him, the moment at the entrance had not been unusual. It had simply been another reminder of how quickly people formed conclusions when they believed they understood a situation. Behind him, small groups of investors and entrepreneurs continued their conversations about partnerships, funding strategies, and the future of coastal development projects. A pair of venture capital partners had begun describing a new logistics platform designed to streamline marina traffic along the Atlantic coast, and several guests leaned closer to hear the details while waiters moved quietly through the crowd carrying trays of drinks. Not far from them, Lindsay Parker stood near the service station beside the bar, her attention moving occasionally toward Adrian as she continued assisting the bartenders with organizing the flow of guests. Her posture had returned to the calm professionalism expected at events like this, yet the thoughts moving through her mind were very different from those she had carried earlier in the evening. When she had first seen Adrian standing at the base of the ramp, she had made a quick judgment based on appearances and the guest list displayed on her tablet. She had believed she understood the situation. Now she understood something else entirely. Across the deck, a group of guests who had arrived later in the evening were hearing the story for the first time. One of them raised his eyebrows in disbelief when another guest explained what had happened at the entrance. "You mean the owner of the yacht was actually told he could not come aboard?" he asked quietly. The woman who had witnessed the scene nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "and he never once raised his voice." The man shook his head with quiet admiration. "That kind of patience is rare," he replied. Near the bow of the yacht, Richard stood speaking with two investors who had been discussing potential expansion opportunities for luxury marina developments along the Florida coast. Although he continued participating in the conversation, his attention occasionally drifted toward Adrian as well. The earlier misunderstanding had changed the way he viewed the evening. As the organizer responsible for the entire event, Richard had initially worried that the moment at the entrance might damage the atmosphere of the celebration. Instead, it had done something unexpected. It had revealed something about everyone present. Some guests had responded with curiosity, others with reflection, and a few with quiet respect for the way Adrian had handled the situation. Adrian eventually turned away from the rail and walked slowly across the deck toward the center of the gathering. Several guests greeted him warmly as he passed, each introduction now carrying the recognition that had been missing earlier in the night. One of the investors who had spoken with him before stepped forward again with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Colebrook," he said, "I have been thinking about something since earlier this evening." Adrian paused politely, inviting the question. The investor continued. "When you arrived at the yacht, you must have known that you could reveal your identity immediately and avoid the entire misunderstanding." Adrian nodded slightly. "That would have been possible," he replied. The investor studied him with curiosity. "Then why did you choose to wait?" he asked. Adrian looked briefly across the deck where the lights reflected softly against the polished floorboards. For a moment he said nothing. Then he answered in the same calm voice he had used all evening. "Because moments like that reveal more than introductions ever could," he said. The small group around him fell quiet as they considered the meaning behind the statement. Adrian continued gently. "When people believe they are speaking to someone without influence or authority, they often reveal the assumptions they carry without realizing it." The investor nodded slowly, understanding the message behind the words. Not far away, Lindsay overheard part of the conversation while arranging a set of glasses beside the bar. She paused briefly, listening as Adrian spoke with the guests gathered around him. The tone of his voice remained calm and reflective, not accusatory. He was not trying to embarrass anyone. He was simply explaining a truth that many people rarely stop to examine. Adrian continued speaking. The interesting thing about assumptions, he said, is that they feel very certain in the moment. But certainty, without curiosity, often leads to mistakes. One of the guests asked another question. "And what did tonight reveal to you?" he said. Adrian smiled slightly. "That people are still learning to look beyond the surface of a situation before deciding what it means," he replied. The music shifted again into another gentle melody while a waiter moved past with a tray of sparkling drinks for the nearby guests. The night air remained warm and calm as the yacht rested quietly against the marina dock. Lindsay looked toward Adrian again from across the deck. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Adrian gave a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to the conversation with the investors around him. The gesture carried no trace of resentment, only calm recognition. Lindsay returned the nod quietly before continuing her work beside the bar. The lesson of the evening had already settled deeply into her thoughts. Across the deck the conversations continued, the story of the evening now woven into the memory of everyone present as the celebration carried on beneath the golden lights of the yacht. The evening on the yacht had settled into its most relaxed rhythm as the hours moved quietly toward midnight, and the marina around them glowed beneath a calm sky scattered with distant stars. The music drifting across the upper deck carried a slow, steady melody that blended with the low hum of conversation and the gentle sound of water brushing against the hull. From a distance the scene looked exactly like what Harbor Circle had intended to create when they planned the gathering. Elegant guests, polished glasses, and a luxury vessel floating beneath the lights of Miami. Yet for the people standing on the deck that night, the event had already become something more memorable than a typical celebration. The earlier moment at the entrance had quietly transformed the entire atmosphere of the evening. The story had now spread to every corner of the yacht. Even guests who had arrived late were hearing the details from those who had witnessed it firsthand. Adrian Colebrook stood near the center of the deck again, speaking calmly with a small circle of investors who had gathered around him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. His posture remained relaxed, his voice steady as he answered questions about maritime investments and the future of luxury vessel partnerships along the Atlantic coast. Nothing about his demeanor suggested that anything unusual had happened earlier in the evening. Yet the people listening to him now understood that the calm confidence they were seeing had been present from the very beginning. One of the younger entrepreneurs in the group studied Adrian for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Colebrook," he said carefully, "I think many people here learned something tonight." Adrian looked at him with a thoughtful expression. The entrepreneur continued, "When you arrived earlier, you were treated like someone who did not belong here. And yet you responded with patience instead of anger." Adrian rested his hands lightly together before answering. "Anger rarely teaches people anything useful," he said calmly. The small group fell quiet as they considered his words. The entrepreneur nodded slowly. "I suppose patience can reveal more than confrontation," he said. Adrian gave a small smile. "Often it does," he replied. Across the deck, Lindsay Parker was finishing a quiet conversation with one of the bartenders when she noticed Adrian stepping slightly away from the group of investors. For a moment she hesitated, considering whether she should approach him. The earlier misunderstanding still weighed on her mind. She had apologized once already when he stepped aboard the yacht, but something about the calm way he had handled the situation made her feel that the moment deserved more reflection than a quick apology. After a brief pause, she walked slowly across the deck toward him. Adrian noticed her approaching and turned slightly to face her. The golden lights above them reflected softly across the polished deck floor, and the sound of quiet conversations continued around them as other guests mingled nearby. Lindsay stopped a few steps away, maintaining the respectful posture she had carried since returning to the yacht. "Mr. Colebrook," she said gently. Adrian nodded in acknowledgement. "Good evening again, Lindsay," he replied. The fact that he remembered her name immediately caught her slightly off guard. "I wanted to speak with you for a moment," she said. Adrian gestured lightly toward the rail where the marina lights shimmered across the water. "Of course," he said. They stepped a short distance away from the center of the crowd where the noise of conversation softened slightly. Lindsay took a quiet breath before speaking again. "I have been thinking about what happened earlier," she said. Adrian listened calmly. Lindsay continued, "When I stopped you at the entrance, I believed I was simply enforcing the rules of the event. But I realize now that I made a decision about who you were before asking enough questions. Adrian watched the water for a moment before answering. That kind of moment happens more often than people realize, he said quietly. Lindsay looked down briefly before meeting his gaze again. I hope it did not leave you with a negative impression of the evening, she said. Adrian shook his head gently. No, he replied. In fact, it reminded me of something important. Lindsay tilted her head slightly with curiosity. What is that? She asked. Adrian rested his hands lightly on the railing as he looked out toward the dark water beyond the marina. That assumptions often reveal more about the person making them than the person receiving them, he said calmly. Lindsay absorbed the thought in silence for a moment. I appreciate your patience earlier, she said. Adrian gave a small nod. You were following the information you had, he replied. Lindsay hesitated before speaking again. Still, I should have paused long enough to question my own certainty, she said. Adrian turned slightly toward her with a thoughtful expression. Certainty can be comforting, he said, but curiosity is often more valuable. The quiet statement carried a gentle wisdom that settled into Lindsay's thoughts. Around them the party continued moving across the deck as waiters passed through the crowd and guests laughed softly beneath the warm lights. The earlier tension of the evening had completely transformed into something reflective and calm. Lindsay smiled faintly before speaking again. I think everyone here will remember what happened tonight, she said. Adrian looked out across the deck where groups of guests continued their conversations. Perhaps they will remember the lesson behind it as well, he replied. Lindsay nodded slowly. I know I will, she said. Adrian glanced back toward the center of the gathering where Richard was now speaking with a group of investors near the bow. Moments like this have a way of staying with people longer than they expect, he said. Lindsay followed his gaze across the deck before returning her attention to him. Thank you for allowing the evening to continue peacefully, she said sincerely. Adrian smiled slightly. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply allowing people the opportunity to understand what happened, he replied. The breeze moved gently across the deck again, carrying the quiet sound of water tapping against the hull. The night around the yacht remained calm and luminous beneath the lights of the marina. Lindsay gave a respectful nod before stepping back toward the service station where the bartenders were preparing another round of drinks for the guests. Adrian remained by the rail for a moment longer, watching the reflections of the yacht lights ripple across the water as the celebration continued behind him. The night continued drifting forward with the quiet elegance that only the open water and warm marina lights could create, and the yacht now moved slowly away from the dock as the captain guided it gently into the calm stretch of Biscayne Bay. The engines hummed softly beneath the polished decks while the skyline of Miami expanded across the horizon in glowing lines of silver and gold. From the upper deck the view was breathtaking. Glass towers shimmered in the distance while smaller boats passed quietly across the dark water like scattered lanterns drifting across the bay. The guests leaned along the railings or gathered in relaxed circles as the celebration reached its most comfortable stage of the evening. Conversations had grown easier now, less formal, more reflective. What had begun earlier as a glamorous investment gathering had gradually transformed into something more memorable. The story of the entrance moment had traveled through every corner of the yacht, and by now nearly every guest present had heard some version of it. Yet the tone of those conversations had changed over the past hour. Instead of amusement or surprise, many guests now spoke about it with a thoughtful respect. Adrian Colebrook stood near the bow again, the breeze moving gently through his jacket as he looked across the water. The city lights reflected across the surface of the bay in long shimmering streaks, and the sound of the music behind him blended with the steady rhythm of the yacht cutting smoothly through the water. He had attended many gatherings like this over the years: corporate celebrations, investment conferences, private dinners on yachts, or in penthouse lounges overlooking city skylines. Yet evenings like this one always carried a quiet reminder of something deeper than business success. Moments when the difference between appearance and truth revealed itself in ways no speech or presentation ever could. Behind him, Richard stepped forward, holding a small microphone connected to the sound system of the yacht. Earlier in the evening, he had planned to make a short speech thanking the investors and partners who had gathered for the event, But after everything that had unfolded, he had realized that the moment required a slightly different approach. The music softened as he spoke into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention for just a moment." Conversations gradually quieted across the deck as guests turned toward him. Some leaned against the railings while others set their glasses down on nearby tables. Richard continued, speaking with a calm and respectful tone. "First, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight on behalf of Harbor Circle. Your presence here means a great deal to our team and to the partnerships we are building across the industry." The guests nodded politely while he spoke. "But tonight has also given us an unexpected moment that reminded us of something important," Richard continued. Several guests exchanged knowing glances, already aware of what he was referring to. Earlier this evening, someone arrived at this yacht quietly and without introduction. For a few minutes we did not recognize the significance of that moment. But the way it unfolded reminded many of us that respect and curiosity should always come before assumption. The crowd listened with thoughtful silence. Richard then turned slightly toward Adrian. "Mr. Colebrook," he said, "on behalf of everyone here tonight, thank you for allowing this gathering to take place aboard your vessel and for the example of patience and dignity you showed earlier this evening." A quiet wave of applause spread across the deck, beginning with a few guests near the front and gradually growing as others joined in. Adrian inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, his expression calm, as always. Richard then gestured toward him. "If you would be willing to share a few words with us," he said respectfully. Adrian paused for a moment before stepping forward toward the center of the deck. The applause faded into silence as the guests waited. He accepted the microphone gently from Richard and looked out across the faces gathered beneath the warm lights. Many of them had been watching him since the moment he stepped onto the yacht earlier that evening. Others had only heard the story afterward, but every person on board now understood the meaning behind the moment. Adrian held the microphone comfortably, but did not rush to speak. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the water surrounding the yacht before returning his gaze to the crowd. "Thank you for being here tonight," he began calmly. His voice carried easily across the deck without needing to rise. "I am glad the yacht could provide a place for this gathering." Several guests nodded appreciatively. Adrian continued in the same steady tone. "Earlier this evening, there was a small misunderstanding at the entrance. Some of you witnessed it, and some of you heard about it afterward." The guests listened carefully, the deck completely quiet except for the distant sound of the water moving beneath the hull. Adrian spoke without accusation or resentment. "Moments like that are interesting because they reveal how quickly people make decisions about a situation before they have all the information," he said. A few guests shifted slightly as they listened, clearly recognizing themselves somewhere within that observation. Adrian continued, "But what matters is not the mistake itself. What matters is what people choose to learn from it." He paused briefly before finishing the thought. "Success is not always visible in the way people expect. Sometimes it arrives quietly. Sometimes it walks into a room without announcing itself. The lesson is simple. Treat every person you meet with the same respect you would offer someone you believe to be powerful. Because often you do not yet know the full story." The words settled across the deck with a calm weight that needed no dramatic emphasis. Adrian handed the microphone back to Richard with a small nod before stepping away from the center of the crowd. The applause that followed was stronger than before, not loud or exaggerated but sincere. Several guests exchanged thoughtful glances as they clapped, clearly reflecting on the meaning behind the message they had just heard. Across the deck, Lindsay Parker stood near the bar watching quietly. The words Adrian had spoken carried the same calm wisdom she had felt earlier when he told her that curiosity was often more valuable than certainty. She realized that the lesson of the evening would remain with her long after the yacht returned to the dock. The music gradually returned as the celebration continued across the deck, but the atmosphere had changed once again. The evening was no longer simply a business gathering. It had become a moment that many of the people present would remember whenever they found themselves making quick assumptions about someone they had just met. Adrian walked back toward the rail overlooking the bay, the city lights stretching across the horizon as the yacht continued its smooth path through the calm water. The yacht continued its quiet path across the calm water of Biscayne Bay as the night moved toward its final hour, the lights of Miami glowing across the horizon like a distant constellation reflected on the dark surface of the sea. The celebration had settled into a peaceful rhythm now, the earlier excitement gradually softening into smaller conversations and quiet laughter beneath the warm golden lights strung across the deck. Glasses rested on polished tables. The music drifted through the open air with a smooth instrumental melody, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of salt water across the gathering. Yet even as the evening approached its close, the meaning of what had happened earlier still lingered in the atmosphere, like a quiet lesson shared among strangers who had unexpectedly witnessed something deeper than a business event. Adrian Colebrook stood once more near the rail of the yacht, looking out across the water while the reflections of the city lights stretched across the bay. The yacht moved steadily through the calm waves, its engines humming softly beneath the deck. From this vantage point, the entire marina and skyline seemed peaceful and distant, a reminder of how small a moment could appear when viewed against the larger horizon of time and experience. Behind him, the guests continued speaking with one another, but the tone of those conversations had changed. The evening had begun with introductions, investments, and networking opportunities. It was ending with reflection. Richard approached Adrian quietly, his posture more relaxed now that the tension from earlier had completely faded into understanding. The speech Adrian had given a short while before had left a clear impression on the guests gathered aboard the yacht. Richard rested his hands lightly on the rail beside him and looked out toward the distant skyline. "I believe everyone here will remember tonight for a long time," he said gently. Adrian glanced toward him with a small, calm smile. "Some evenings leave a stronger impression than others," he replied. Richard nodded slowly. "When we planned this event, we hoped people would leave thinking about partnerships and opportunities," he said. "Instead, they are leaving with something much more meaningful." Adrian watched the water for a moment before answering. "Sometimes the most valuable lessons are the ones no one planned to teach," he said quietly. Across the deck, Lindsay Parker stood near the bar speaking with one of the servers who had been assisting with the evening service. Her posture was calm again, but the thoughts moving through her mind were far deeper than when the evening began. She had replayed the moment at the entrance many times during the past few hours. The confidence she had felt when she first stopped Adrian at the ramp. The certainty she had carried when she believed the guest list told the entire story. And the calm patience Adrian had shown while waiting for the truth to reveal itself. She understood now that the moment had changed something in her perspective that would remain with her long after the yacht returned to the dock. The server beside her glanced toward Adrian at the rail and spoke quietly. "It is not every night someone learns a lesson like that in front of an entire yacht full of investors," he said. Lindsay gave a thoughtful nod. "No," she replied, "but I am glad I learned it tonight instead of later." The server tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" he asked. Lindsay looked across the deck again before answering. "I mean that it is better to recognize our assumptions while we still have time to change them," she said calmly. On the opposite side of the deck, a group of investors continued discussing the meaning of Adrian's words from the speech earlier. One of them spoke quietly while looking toward the water. "He did not accuse anyone directly," the man said, "but the message was clear." Another investor nodded slowly. "Respect should never depend on whether we believe someone is important," he replied. The first man lifted his glass thoughtfully. "Tonight reminded me that we never really know the full story of the person standing in front of us," he said. Nearby, another guest added softly, "That is why dignity should never be conditional." The yacht began turning slowly back toward the marina, the captain guiding the vessel through the open channel as the lights of the dock gradually grew closer again. The skyline reflected across the water as the yacht approached the familiar row of moored boats and illuminated walkways that lined the harbor. The celebration had begun hours earlier at that very dock, when Adrian had stepped quietly toward the gangway without an introduction or an announcement. Now the evening was returning to the same place where the unexpected lesson had begun. Adrian noticed the dock lights appearing ahead and took a final look across the open water before turning back toward the deck. The guests were beginning to gather their belongings, finishing their conversations, and preparing to disembark once the yacht returned to the marina. Richard stepped away to assist with coordinating the final moments of the event, speaking with the crew and thanking the guests who approached him with appreciative handshakes. Lindsay moved toward the entrance of the gangway once more, ready to guide the guests as they departed. But this time her posture carried a quiet awareness she had not possessed earlier in the evening. Adrian walked slowly toward the center of the deck as the yacht eased gently against the dock. The crew secured the lines, and the soft hum of the engines faded into silence as the vessel came to rest where the evening had begun. The guests gathered near the gangway, exchanging final handshakes and promises to continue their conversations in the coming weeks. One by one, they stepped down onto the dock beneath the warm lights of the marina. As Adrian approached the gangway, Lindsay stood waiting beside it. Their eyes met briefly, and this time there was no uncertainty between them, only mutual understanding. Lindsay offered a respectful nod. "Thank you for an unforgettable evening, Mr. Colebrook," she said quietly. Adrian returned the nod with the same calm composure he had shown all night. "Thank you for the work you did tonight, Lindsay," he replied. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I will remember what you said earlier," she said. Adrian paused at the top of the ramp before stepping down toward the dock. "The most important lesson," he answered gently, "is that dignity should never depend on recognition." Lindsay nodded slowly as Adrian stepped onto the dock and began walking along the marina path beneath the glowing lights of the harbor. Behind him, the yacht remained quiet against the water, and the guests who had witnessed the evening's events carried the story with them as they disappeared into the night. And long after the lights of the yacht faded behind them, the lesson of that quiet moment at the entrance remained clear. Real power does not demand attention. It simply reveals itself when the moment arrives.